Today on the Perception in Action podcast, a look at the Sports Biometrics Conference, which was held in San Francisco from November 13th through the 15th, 2016. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I'm going to give a short report about a conference I recently attended and presented at, the Sports Biometrics Conference, which was a 2-day event held in San Francisco and was organized by Bob Hodgson from Synapse Events. The conference featured a mix of technology companies, reps from various sports teams, coaches, media, and a few academics like me thrown in for good luck. So I thought I would give you some of the highlights. It was kicked off on the first day by keynote speaker Eric Heiden. For those not familiar with that name, I think the best way to put it is, Eric Heiden is my generation's Michael Phelps. Heiden is a speed skater who won 5 gold medals in the 1980 Olympics. What is quite remarkable about Eric's performance, and sets it apart a bit from Phelps in my mind, is that he truly covered the full range from speed to endurance. His wins included distances from the 50 meter, which takes about 15 seconds to complete, to the 10,000 meter, which takes about 15 minutes. He is now an orthopedic surgeon. In his presentation, he mostly talked about his career as an athlete. The most interesting part for me was his discussion of how sports science changed from when his career first started. Unlike most athletes at that time, Heiden was fortunate enough to have access to a full-fledged physiology lab at the University of Wisconsin, where they did a variety of tests and measurements, like VO2 max and body fat on him. He also discussed how periodization of training was the real new innovation in the late 70s, and emphasized the importance of diversity in training. He himself participated in a variety of sports as a kid, including hockey, swimming, and even figure skating. Finally, he emphasized that a big change he saw during his career was a switch to practice with a purpose, where every session had a special goal rather than just filling up a calendar with a bunch of miles and times. This, of course, echoes the idea of deliberate practice. The next speaker I want to mention was Ron Haverluck from Swimming Technology Research. He gave a really interesting talk in which he considered a few different reasons why there's often a disconnect between sports scientists on the one hand and what is actually going on in the field on the other. He cited 3 main issues: misuse of scientific terminology, lack of use of scientific method, and miscommunication and distrust between scientists and practitioners. For the terminology issue, he gave a great example from the TV show Superhumans. The episode he discussed featured a man named Jim Dreyer, nicknamed the Human Tugboat, who can pull a 27-ton ferry while swimming. On the show, it was emphasized that Dreyer needs superhuman strength to do this. Rod presented an interesting analysis showing that the actual amount of strength Dreyer has in his swimming stroke, in other words, the amount of force he can generate when moving through the water, is no greater than the several of the teenage girls Haverluck coaches. It's not the strength that makes Dreyer remarkable, it is strength endurance. That is the ability to maintain this force over a long period, not just a couple of strokes. Similarly, he pointed out that it's not the weight of the ferry, 27 tons, that is the issue when it's in the water. It is the resistance, which depends as much on its shape as its weight. In terms of the scientific method, he echoed a common concern in analytics that too much effort is put into analysis of data without any particular hypotheses, theories, or research questions in mind. In terms of communication, he discussed the frequent butting of heads he sees between science and conventional wisdom. For example, he talked about an interesting swimming performance metric called the Arm Coordination Index, which measures how consistently a swimmer is producing force in the stroke, and he showed how conventional catch-up drills, commonly used by coaches, essentially reinforce a negative coordination index, which is bad. Finally, he echoed what a few practitioners said at the conference. A lot of what we do as researchers in sports science is not presented in an applicable form. It is presented to be consumed by other researchers. The The final speaker I want to mention from the first day of the conference was Kirk Jacob, assistant GM of the Golden State Warriors. He discussed what ended up being one of the clear themes of the conference, the issue of invasiveness and privacy when it comes to wearables and monitoring devices in sports. Apparently, this year when the NHL and NFL players' unions met for the first time, the first issue on both of their agendas was this. They were essentially encouraging players not to wear any type of fitness trackers, etc. Jacob discussed two issues related to this. Invasiveness. Anything players have to wear that is noticeable to them is going to be a hard sell. He also talked about how players and the union worry about the implications that arise from being monitored. In particular, whether data from, for example, sleep monitoring or heart rate data could be used in contract negotiations. Finally, he raised an interesting issue I have never really thought about. How do you monitor an athlete when they're away from the team? For example, in terms of the sleep they're getting. His joke was that Stephen Curry and Kevin Durant really work for Nike and Under Armour. Playing basketball for Golden State is only their part-time job. To him, this inability to keep track of what players are doing away from the team is problematic for a couple reasons. First, the effects of travel on sleep are one of the biggest performance issues they have to deal with. Second, players can fall prey to a lot of pseudoscience claims when they're not being vetted. The second day of the conference was kicked off by Yahoo Sports writer Jeff Passan, whose latest book, The Arm, I discussed back in episode 35A. He had a couple interesting themes in his presentation. First, like in his book, he is very skeptical that we are going to be able to solve an issue like arm injuries in pitching with simple wearables and analyzing basic metrics because it's a multivariate problem. Related to this, he talked about the monitoring sleeve from Modus. See the link in the show notes if you're interested. He also echoed a sentiment of a few of the other speakers. In the grand scheme of things, sports is pretty unimportant in society. However, the innovations we are making in terms of technology and analytics within sport could play an important role when they're applied to other societal issues. On the second day of the conference, there was also a very interesting panel discussion about the future of wearable monitoring technology, which included representatives from Pebble, Google X, and Athos. If you've never heard of them, Athos is a particularly interesting sports-related company who, among other things, is developing surface EMG sensors that can be sewn into athletic clothing. Again, in this panel, the issue of privacy was discussed, with a couple of the panelists believing that 2017 is going to be a big year for the development of policy related to sensor use in sports. In particular, who owns the data that's collected. I also wanted to mention Peter Fatty, who I interviewed back in episode 26D. He gave his usually great talk about occlusion training in baseball. He also presented data from a really interesting recent study looking at transfer of training from playing Guitar Hero, the video game. What was found in the study is that playing Guitar Hero helps music perception. Players are better able to discriminate different notes and tempos, but it has no effect on the transfer of action. That is actually playing the guitar itself. So overall, this was a very interesting conference. Again, the big issues I saw related to sensor monitoring technology in sport were the need for validity tests of different measures, amen to that, the importance of researchers presenting information in an applicable manner, and the big issue of intrusiveness and privacy. I hope this is the first of many more conferences like this to come. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Coming soon on the Perception and Action podcast, my second Christmas/holiday special. As always, you can contact me via email, robgray@asu.edu, follow me on Twitter @ShakyWeights, and find all the information about this podcast at perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.